This is the piece that I wanted to talk about last week, but with all that was happening, we had to really get some other stuff involved. But this is about our national debt. I'm not just talking about the deficit. Remember, the sum total of all the deficits over the years is what give us a national debt, which right now is at somewhere in the order of, I think, 30 trillion, several trillion dollars. But how did we get there? Here's the thing. Remember, when Clinton left office, we left with a balanced budget. They had some tax increases, so the deficit it was a balanced budget, no deficit, and we started to pay down the cumulative debt. All right, let's remember that. That was the trajectory that we were on. Bush comes in, a Republican comes in and reversed the whole thing by giving a huge tax cut. That tax cut ballooned the deficit, the budget deficit, and increased our debt. Then, of course, we did the irresponsible thing in lying ourselves into a war that cost us a lot of money. Steve Rattner, in this report that I'm going to show about the debt, didn't quite put that the expenditures for the Iraq war were huge, caused the problem. The expenditures for recovering from the supposedly the attack around the world to solve the terrorist problem, all of that was wasted money that we all paid for that was accumulated onto the deficit. Likewise, we had Donald Trump come in and he did two things to balloon the debt even more so than anybody else. The first thing is he gave that huge tax cut to the wealthy mostly. Yes, people got their deduction increased, etc. But most of the money went to the wealthy. The vast majority of the money went to the wealthy. But above and beyond that, his incompetence of dealing with COVID and allowing COVID to turn into a pandemic. What we had was something spreading that could have been mitigated. If we didn't stop people from wearing masks, if we didn't have the arguments on ivermectin, if we didn't have the argument of injecting stuff into your blood, if we didn't have the argument as far as keeping people at home in the beginning for 2 weeks, just saying, let's let this stuff burn out like they did in Australia, New Zealand, etc. Hold back. Just let people hold back for a minute, and every time you play whack-a-mole with the disease after that, right? For the things that slip through, you play whack-a-mole. There were countries who did that. There were countries who were so poor they couldn't afford the medicines. Panama is one of them. The people followed the rules. They wore the mask. They stayed home when they needed to stay home. And it never spread and killed people and cost the amount of money that it costs in the United States. So that budget deficit, all those incentives that we had to give for COVID, we would not have needed it if we didn't have an incompetent thug running the White House then. Then, of course, in 2008, under Obama, we had the big bank bailout, 2008, because of the incompetence of wealthy bankers who turned derivatives and credit default swaps and all these different financial instruments. They collapsed on themselves because these guys were creating money out of nothing, creating financial instruments because they thought they were so smart. Of course, they're not, but they thought they were so smart. So they created all these financial instruments and they turned things like mortgages, etc., into these commoditized instruments that they sold to people after the real estate market collapsed from their own doing. The Obama administration, starting with the Bush administration, then the Obama administration, bailed them out. So all of that went into the national debt again, because it ballooned the deficit and it was added to the national debt. So we had two humongous tax cuts, Bush and Trump. Then we had the complete horrendous handling of COVID that affected the entire world because of a neophyte thug in the White House that got a lot of people who should not have been killed from COVID because they allowed fallacies, they allowed misinformation, they allowed it's simply ridiculous. Then, of course, again, the 2008 recovery, the budget bill. all the other stuff that they call increase in discretionary spending, etc. All this increase in discretionary spending that they always talk about, you need to keep discretionary spending expanding at the same rate of the economy. Hey, I agree with that. But why was discretionary spending not being able to pay it for? Because you had all the damn tax cuts. So even as Steve Rattner in this piece that I'm going to play explains the truth, the thing that these economists, this capitalist economists refuse to talk about is that absent the tax cut, none of these things would have occurred. We would have had a balanced budget, and we could have increased our discretionary spending as it should have been increased, right? Meaning Social Security and all, well, the Social Security isn't discretionary spending, but the other type of spending, we should have increased them because, again, there are new things that we want to get done in a society. Just tax the folks appropriately. We see the kind of taxation that we're given right now, how it has caused the millionaires and the billionaires to just keep multiplying their monies for producing nothing. They just get rich from being rich, and they get richer from being richer. That's what's occurring right now. So the entire fault of the budget deficits, the big debt, not the deficit solely, but the big debt, is one, tax cuts by Republicans, Obama and Bush giving a whole bunch of money, TARP and all the others, to the bankers, and also, again, not taxing enough. Now, giving you that background, I want you to listen to Steve Rattner, but listen to it with the framing that I've just pointed out, because he's not going to tell you the complete picture as far as the debt. By the end of it, and looking at those charts, you should easily see that if we had, after Clinton left office with a balanced budget, had we followed the rules and taxed appropriately, handled COVID appropriately, and not allow bankers to do what they did with credit default swaps and all of that, have the appropriate regulations, and made sure that COVID and everything else was handled appropriately, we would have had a balanced budget and a booming economy, because we would not have had these thugs that we have in finance running our country. It would have been all of us collectively. Check this out, and then we'll take it on the other side.
Steve, let's continue this conversation about the so-called Big Beautiful Bill and its impact on the national debt.
But let's take a look at what the bill, as it was written in the House, would actually do. First of all, it's important to note that we're already, as I think everybody knows, starting with a really large deficit. Our deficit is almost $2 trillion right now. While it's projected to go down slightly, it would otherwise then keep climbing up to about between $2 and $2.5 trillion. That's if we do nothing. The Big Beautiful Bill, you can look at two ways. As it is written, it would do this. So it would have the budget deficit still higher than we have. But there are a bunch of gimmicks in there in terms of making things expire that aren't really going to end up expiring. And so I think the real way to look at this Big Beautiful Bill is it would take the deficit out to $3 trillion in 2035. And that becomes a huge amount. And then you see what it does to the debt. So right now we're sitting here with $37 trillion of debt compared to a GDP. The whole size of our economy is only $30 trillion, meaning our debt is bigger than our economy. That's the only other time this has happened was in World War II. So we're starting with a huge debt load. And then no matter really what you do, because the deficit stays high, no matter what you do, the Big Beautiful Bill makes it worse. You could end up out here with $55 trillion of debt. So the debt growing faster than the economy, this becomes unsustainable. And this is what the deficit hawks are really focused on.
What are the risks to a debt that is larger than the economy?
Well, what you've seen happen in the last few weeks as this bill has been moving through Congress is periodic spurts of interest rates moving up. The federal government has to sell this debt periodically. It rolls over, it matures, they have to go out in the market and sell it. And the risk is that we pay higher and higher interest rates for our debt. And that in turn, as we'll look at in a few charts, squeezes out other kinds of spending and puts inordinate pressure on our debt and forces some really, really unpleasant things. At some point, reversing tax cuts when the market says it's enough. We're not going to keep financing these kinds of deficits. It's really a burden we're leaving to our children and our grandchildren. And that is an incredibly selfish act that we're doing.
All right. Speaking of tax cuts, let's look to your second chart. These are, in your words, absolutely massive tax cuts, dwarfing anything we saw from the first Trump administration.
Yeah. So this bill, again, there's a bunch of gimmicks in it. You can look at it as a $2.4 trillion bill. You can look at it as a $4 trillion increase to the deficit. But compare it to all the stuff we've done in the last few years. The bipartisan infrastructure law looks puny compared to this. The rescue plan, half the size of this. The CARES Act, which was Trump's COVID rescue plan, $1.7 trillion. And here, Trump's signature tax bill from his first administration, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, $1.5 trillion. So compared to his last tax cut, we're talking about something that is massively different. Why is it so big? He wants to extend all the tax cuts that were set to expire in the last bill. This was the gimmick in the last bill. They use these gimmicks to make these bills look smaller because then they come back and extend the tax cut, increase the standard deduction, increase the child tax cut. And then these are a bunch of campaign promises that Trump made sort of out of nowhere in states and in places where it would be politically advantageous. No tax on overtime, no tax on car loan interest, no tax on tips, and so forth. They want to increase defense spending. He promised no taxes on Social Security for seniors. You can't do that through this process, but he came up with a workaround to basically provide the same thing. And then there are the cuts. And this is what Elon Musk is on about, rescinding the IRA climate funds. This is the EV tax credit in here. And these are the Medicaid cuts, $700 billion, which have not only gotten criticism from Democrats, but even Republicans like Josh Hawley, a very conservative Republican, has said this can't happen. And so, as we talked about in the last block, you've got people on both sides of this pushing in different directions, which is going to make this unbelievably difficult to get through the Senate. And then it has to go back to the House and be reconciled with the bill that they passed.
Let's go to your third chart. You say debt is difficult to tame.
Why did Elon Musk fail so spectacularly? The president had talked during the campaign about cutting $2 trillion. Elon talked about cutting $1 trillion. The final number is probably less than $150 billion, maybe $100 billion. And by the way, yes, people are dying because of that. That's been now well documented. But the reason it's so hard to cut is because so much of the budget is kind of off limits. Nobody wants to cut Medicare. Nobody wants to cut Social Security. You can't cut interest, obviously. People want to increase defense. Veterans benefits, probably not. Food stamps, maybe a little bit, something there. And then, of course, you have the Medicaid piece down here. But everything else that's left out of a $7 trillion budget is only about $1 trillion. You can't cut $2 trillion out of $1 trillion. You can't cut $1 trillion out of $1 trillion. And so that's why when Doge got in there, they found there really wasn't very much to do. But let's just say a word of what could have been, because we've now had 25 years of basic fiscal irresponsibility going back to the Bush tax cuts in 2001. And so if we had not increased discretionary spending faster than the economy, we could have increased it, just not as fast as we did. If we had not had all these tax bills, the Bush tax cuts and then the TCJA and so forth, the recession response, you could say we really had to do, but it costs a lot of money. But in any event, if we had not done this stuff, we still would have had a government that was growing, and we would have ended up in 2021 with essentially no debt. This was the missed opportunity. Now, because so much of the spending is constrained, now because we're paying so much interest, it's impossible to do something like this.
Well, look, I hope you attached the preamble of what I spoke about onto what Rattner had to say to see the entire picture. There's one other thing that I want to point out. I remember Doge, that thing that was supposed to save a lot of money. We knew that it could not have worked. Doge was never there to save money. Doge was always there for these guys to get in there and take all our data. And God knows what they're going to do with our data. They have their servers in there. They're monitoring a whole lot of stuff. That's what Doge is there for. And by the way, and in the process, Elon Musk became what I call a virtual assassin, because with his irresponsible cutting of USAID and other policies, a lot of people died. And in fact, there's documentation that shows he has killed over 100,000 people by holding back all the work that USAID does. So much for the humane country, so much for the people who believe in the sanctity of life. They have come in and destroyed it. And with the bill that they want to pass now, and it's not only foreigners that are going to get killed, but Americans are going to be, what again? Murdered by their own government as these policies come into play. And we'll continue to talk about it.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.